On June 22, 1941, at 3:15 a.m. Berlin time, German border guards called the Russian border guards to the bridge over the Bug River near Kolodno to discuss something important. When the Russians approached, the Germans mowed them down with machine guns, thus initiating Operation Barbarossa, the largest military operation in history. Over 4 million Axis soldiers advanced into the Soviet Union along a front nearly 1,500 kilometers long, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, progressing at a remarkable speed. After 3 months, the Wehrmacht was at the gates of Moscow, but the failure of Operation Typhoon in early December marked the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. Despite catastrophic losses, the USSR somehow managed to defend itself that winter of 1941 and then launched a counteroffensive. This operation opened the bloodiest front of World War II, the so-called Eastern Front. After swift victories in the West and the intense bombing of Britain, Hitler turned to the realization of his greatest dream, to push back the borders of the Slavic world and create a new empire in the East. The plan envisaged creating Lebensraum, or living space, by cleansing the territories of the savages in the East. Millions of young Germans had been convinced since childhood that the Soviet Union threatened their nation's survival. The Führer was extremely confident, deciding to ignore Bismarck's warning that Russia should not be attacked if there was a risk of a two-front war. He justified his long-standing desire to crush Jewish Bolshevism by claiming it would be the most certain way to force Great Britain into an agreement. His arrogance was evident in underestimating the level of military and industrial development that Stalin had already achieved, in his casual disregard for Russia's almost boundless expanse, and in the woefully inadequate logistical support for a long war. After the victory in the West, it never crossed his mind that it might be far more challenging to defeat a society accustomed to harshness and suffering. Although a significant part of the Wehrmacht's high command was against a war in the East, with a few exceptions, everyone believed that the USSR was a backward state with an army devastated by Stalin's purges. As part of the plan to dissuade Hitler from war, the German military attaché in Moscow was allowed to visit some huge weapons factories being built in Siberia. However, his report had the opposite effect of what was intended. To the general's astonishment, the Third Reich's leader said, "Do you see how far they have come? We must strike immediately." On the eve of the German invasion, the Soviet Union was a society with the strictest regulations and the strongest police oversight in the world. Its mechanism of domestic repression was highly developed, and by 1941 had killed more people than Nazism. Stalin's purges had decimated the command cadre and slowed the modernization of the Red Army. All this was well known to the Nazi intelligence service. In addition, the Red Army units in the western part of the country were poorly deployed to avoid provoking the Nazis. German preparations for aggression against the USSR began in the summer of 1940. On July 21st, Field Marshal Brauchitsch, commander of the ground forces, was tasked with studying the problems of waging war in the East. On July 31st, Hitler announced to the military leadership that the decision was final. The basic idea of the plan was to defeat Soviet forces west of Moscow and to occupy the territory of the USSR up to the line Rostov-Gorky-Arkhangelsk. To achieve these goals, the main forces were to operate through Minsk and Smolensk towards Moscow, while weaker forces were to advance south towards Kiev and north towards Leningrad. The execution deadline was set at 9 weeks, or a maximum of 17. After necessary modifications and additions, the Führer signed Directive Number 21 on December 18th. The operational plan was codenamed Barbarossa, named after the German king and emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. The directive also stated that assistance from Romania and Finland could be expected. On March 13, 1941, the directive was supplemented with regulations on the organization of political administration in the occupied areas. This task was entrusted to Himmler and his Einsatzgruppen. An unexpected event in Yugoslavia on March 27th delayed the attack for 4 weeks. The final date was set for April 30th and was to be June 22nd. For the aggression, 152 divisions were prepared: 104 infantry, 19 armored, 10 motorized, 4 SS motorized, 1 cavalry, 1 SS police, 4 mountain, and 9 for security. They had 50,000 artillery pieces, 3,500 tanks, 4,000 aircraft, 625,000 horses, and 500,000 motor vehicles. Additionally, the Finns and Romanians contributed another 29 well-equipped divisions. The forces were divided into 3 army groups: North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb; Center, commanded by Field Marshal Feder von Bock; and South, commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. As for the USSR, while the Nazis were rampaging through Western Europe, Stalin was not idle. Strategic conditions for defense were improved by moving the border westward. Since the beginning of the war in 1939, the NKVD had reduced its activities, allowing industry to work at full capacity. Defense expenditures before 1939 accounted for 13% of the total budget, increasing to nearly 27% at the start of the war. Many military factories were opened in the Far East. Special emphasis was placed on designing new tanks, the medium T-34 and the heavy KV, which were superior to Nazi tanks. Most Soviet weaponry was equal to or even better than German equipment, though their anti-tank and anti-aircraft artillery were lacking. Nevertheless, the Red Army was in the process of reorganizing in 1941, so the war came too early for it. A significant flaw was the insufficient supply of communication means. For transportation, the USSR relied on railways, which slowed modernization. But manpower was not lacking. In addition to 4 million active soldiers, the Army had another 15 million in reserve. For border protection, there were 10 armies on the front, but the organization of defense lines was incomplete, and the built structures were not well camouflaged. On the eve of the attack, Soviet forces in the border regions were grouped into 5 military districts: Leningrad, Baltic, Western, Kiev, and Odessa. The fleet was divided into the Northern, Baltic, and Black Sea fleets. Given the scale of the reorganization initiated in 1939, many believed that Stalin was considering attacking the Nazis first when they were exhausted in the West, but the unexpectedly quick defeat of France put him in an unfavorable position. The Red Army soldiers were completely unprepared to deal with the experienced Wehrmacht. Despite knowing who he was dealing with, the leader of the USSR persisted in appeasing Hitler, hoping that the Nazis might not attack after all. The terms of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact were honored, under which the Soviet Union had committed to supplying grain, cotton, metals, and rubber to the Third Reich. In 2 years, the Soviets provided Germany with 26,000 tons of chromium, 140,000 tons of manganese, and over 2 million tons of oil. By June 20th, Uncle Joe had received over 100 warnings about the impending invasion. Richard Sorge even specified the exact day the Germans would attack, but Stalin called all the informants provocateurs. Right before the attack, the German ambassador in Moscow, Count Friedrich von der Schulenburg, an opponent of Nazism, warned the Soviets, "It is only a matter of days before Hitler attacks." On the evening of June 21st, the situation in the Kremlin was increasingly tense. The deputy chief of the NKVD reported that 40 German Luftwaffe planes had violated Soviet airspace in the previous few days. When Stalin heard about a German deserter who crossed the line to warn the Russians about the attack, he ordered him to be shot for spreading disinformation. At 3:15 German time, heavy artillery bombardment began, while strong formations of the German Air Force targeted airfields, naval bases, railway junctions, and cities in the Baltic republics. the Soviet Air Force was caught on the ground. Planes were lined up and made easy targets for Luftwaffe attacks on 66 airfields. It is estimated that about 1,800 fighters and bombers were destroyed on June 22nd, mostly on the ground. The Germans lost only 35 planes, and the Wehrmacht infantry easily broke through the border defensive lines. Soviet border guards were liquidated in their underwear, and their families perished in barracks from artillery shells. Within a few hours, assault armored units captured military depots. Zhukov phoned the Dacha at 4:45, and Stalin was informed of the attack. When the German ambassador informed Molotov that the two countries were at war, the leader of the USSR turned pale. The Wehrmacht advanced at an unprecedented speed. The blitzkrieg tactic proved fantastic. Communication within the front of the Corps and divisions of the Red Army was cut off, so the command could not grasp the extent of the chaos. The overall disarray of the Red Army was exacerbated by Brandenburg Commando units infiltrated just before the start of Operation Barbarossa. Their men secured bridges and cut telephone lines. Soon, large parts of the Baltic republics joined the Nazis. Latvians seized 3 cities from the Soviets before the Wehrmacht arrived, and Estonian partisans claimed to have captured 26,000 Red Army soldiers by the end of the year. Similar sentiments were in Ukraine, where they had not forgotten the Great Famine of 1933, known as the Holodomor, which claimed the lives of over 2 million people. Army Group North advanced rapidly towards Leningrad with the 56th Panzer Corps, then led by General Lieutenant Erich von Manstein, covering almost 80 kilometers a day, reaching halfway to its goal in just 5 days. North of the Pripyat marshes, Army Group Center was forcefully advancing into Belarus and soon engaged in a large encirclement battle with the panzer groups of General Lieutenant Heinz Guderian and General Colonel Hermann Hoth. Only the massive fortress of Brest-Litovsk on the border put up strong resistance. NKVD border units fought desperately if they were not caught off guard. However, Red Army officers frequently abandoned their men and fled in panic. Division and Corps commanders were inexperienced, and fear of denunciation and arrest by Beria's men stifled any initiative. Army Group South advanced into Ukraine, soon joined by 2 Romanian armies under Marshal Ion Antonescu. Stalin wrote a speech about the invasion and ordered Molotov to read it over the radio. After his address, long lines of volunteers immediately formed in front of recruitment centers. The Supreme Command headquarters, Stavka, was established. After the fall of Minsk, the USSR leader yelled at Timoshenko and Zhukov, "Lenin left us a state, and we have destroyed it." After the fall of Lviv, the Southwestern Front units retreated to new defensive lines. Attacking units poured through villages and towns, which their artillery or retreating Soviet units turned into flaming ruins. In early July, Army Group Center continued its advance towards Moscow. As the days passed, even in retreat, the Red Army inflicted increasing losses on the Wehrmacht. In just 18 days of war, the Nazis occupied Lithuania, Latvia, Belarus, Bessarabia, and most of Ukraine. Leningrad was 450 kilometers away, Moscow 550, and Kiev only 300. A significant number of plants and factories fell into German hands. In early July, Berlin was euphoric. General Halder, chief of the General Staff of the Army, declared, "I think I won't exaggerate if I say that the war is won in 2 weeks." Hitler was speaking of holding a victory parade in Moscow by the end of August. Once Stalin recovered from the initial shock and a few days of absence, he made several crucial decisions, the key one being the relocation of industry to the Far East. On July 3rd, he gave a speech calling the people to defend their homeland. He informed the population about the extent of the Nazi advance, encouraged them to fight, and introduced the scorched earth strategy. He concluded by warning about saboteurs in the background. stating that all collaborators with the Nazi occupiers would be shot on the spot. These threats would be codified a month later in Order Number 270, which political commissars would read aloud before thousands of soldiers. All those who found themselves encircled had to fight to the last man, and those who decided to surrender were to be destroyed by all available means. It is believed that during the war, 300,000 Russian soldiers were killed by their own officers, more than the total number of British soldiers who died in the war. In early July, major encirclements began, with the Wehrmacht capturing entire Soviet armies. In the first encirclement west of Minsk, over 400,000 Red Army soldiers were trapped. Despite all the difficulties, the Soviets showed incredible courage, perseverance, and resilience. Even when encircled, they often continued to fight. They switched to partisan warfare. In the occupied territories, the population of the Baltic countries soon realized that the Nazis had not brought them freedom. The Jewish population was systematically cleansed in the occupied territories. The Holocaust gained additional momentum with the attack on the USSR. Camps were not prepared, so hundreds of thousands of prisoners were brought to open air spaces surrounded by barbed wire. There was too little food and water. This was part of the Nazi hunger plan, designed to kill 30 million people to solve the overpopulation problem in the occupied territories. In 1941 alone, over 2 million Soviets died of hunger and disease in the camps. Himmler's bloody killing units followed the Führer's plan. This is a war of extermination. Commanders must sacrifice personal considerations. We do not need hungry mouths. In the advance towards Kyiv, Kleist's 1st Panzer Group encountered the new Red Army tanks for the first time, specifically the KV and T-34. Armored beasts superior to German tanks in many respects. Since the German artillery shells were ineffective against the armor of the KV tanks, the Wehrmacht was forced to bring in 88 mm caliber guns to destroy them. On July 9th, Vitebsk fell, and on the 12th, the Germans captured Suraj and Valige. The Soviet 12th Army fought fanatically, but under the bombardment of Göring's aviation, it was forced to retreat. With Smolensk threatened, it was ordered to evacuate the population and the most valuable cultural treasures. Soon began one of the largest battles of the Eastern Front, the Battle of Smolensk. To capture this city, which lay on the route to Moscow, required 32 divisions. The battle in the Cauldron ended on August 11th, with Soviet forces losing 300,000 irreplaceable men, 3,000 tanks, and as many artillery pieces. Nevertheless, the Nazi advance was slowed, which would later prove extremely important. Despite the terrifyingly deep penetration and signposts pointing to Moscow, Hitler's army on the Eastern Front suddenly feared that victory might not be achieved by the end of the year. The three army groups had lost 213,000 soldiers, only a tenth of Soviet losses. But if the fight to the death continued, the Wehrmacht would struggle to defend overextended supply lines and defeat the remaining enemy forces. The possibility of fighting during the harsh Russian winter was very daunting. The front had expanded from 1,500 to 2,500 kilometers after the failed Russian counterattack at Smolensk. Hitler made a mistake by ordering Army Group Center to go on the defensive, while the northern and southern flanks continued to advance towards Leningrad and Kyiv. Fedor von Bock disagreed with this idea, but many commanders supported the plan to first capture Ukraine's agricultural wealth. Stalin compounded Hitler's mistake with an even greater one. The Soviet leader knew nothing about the concept of deep defense and refused requests for strategic withdrawals, persistently demanding that positions be defended to the last man, leading to many armies being encircled and destroyed. On July 29th, Zhukov warned him that Kyiv would be encircled and that the Ukrainian capital needed to be abandoned, to which the leader replied that he hadn't heard such nonsense in a long time. This recklessness would lead to the largest encirclement in military history. On September 16th, Guderian and Kleist's panzer groups joined near Lochwitza, trapping over 500,000 Red Army soldiers in the encirclement. Field Marshal Walter von Reichenau's 6th Army entered the heavily bombed ruins of Kyiv. Further south, the German 11th and Romanian 4th Armies moved towards Odessa. The next target for Army Group South would be Crimea, with its major naval base at Sevastopol and Krasny Kavkaz. German morale soared again, and the conquest of Moscow became realistic. To Halder's relief, Hitler also realized this. On September 6th, he issued Directive Number 35, authorizing the advance towards the Soviet capital, and on September 16th, Field Marshal Fedor von Bock issued the first order to implement Operation Typhoon. In the north, the situation for the Red Army was no better. On September 8th, the Wehrmacht closed the ring around the industrial center of Leningrad by capturing Schlisselburg, initiating the bloodiest siege of a city in history. At the beginning of the month, Lieutenant Yakov Djugashvili, Stalin's son, was captured. He would die in a Nazi camp as his father refused to negotiate for his release, saying briefly, "It would have been better if he had never been born. Why should he be different from other Red Army soldiers?" Finally, in Operation Typhoon, the Nazi advance would somehow be halted at the gates of Moscow. On December 5th, the Soviet counteroffensive began, which would forever shatter Hitler's dream of capturing the Soviet capital.